And in classic bench event style and hospitality tomorrow, and thank you to Jonathan and the whole team for bringing the world back together. I am delighted to introduce Jesper Palmqvist. He's the Area Director of Asia Pacific STR Global. STR provides premium data, benchmarking, analytics, and marketplace insights for our hospitality sector worldwide. It was founded in 1985. It was acquired in October 2019 as a division of CoStar Group. It is a critical source of brainpower in the hospitality sector intelligence. Jesper, thank you for warming up our stage. We are delighted to have you with us. Over to you, sir. Enjoy.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Anita. I appreciate the opportunity to join you here today, and I will go straight in and share some of the slides because, as you know, STR is a data company. We try to tell stories and give you some insights through various graphs and sometimes the odd humorous image. Now, it should be said that given the time frame, and we're not going to spend hours together, you and I'm going to make some assumptions that you are up to speed, that you have read the news, that you know roughly where we are. And fortunately, with this great platform that the Bench team is providing, there will be breakouts and virtual rooms where we can answer all your questions on various markets that you're not touching. And as we move throughout the day later on, Robin Rossman, obviously our MD, will join in, I believe, 6 hours and take you up on and talk more about Europe and the Middle East. So I will now start with, of course, the overall Asia-Pacific scenario. So without further ado, obviously there's a lot of information that you can find on our website as well, and I hope that you have already found how we deal with the crisis there and all the information that you can do. Now, one of the first things that we started getting questions on a few weeks ago was, how is the closure of hotels impacting our industry? And it's an important piece that we spent weeks and weeks on to try and figure out. And if you look at the darkness of these circles, you can see that in Europe, South America, and southern parts of Africa is clearly where we have more closed rooms. And the Asia picture is maybe perhaps a little bit warped because we did it in February, it would be totally different. The Chinese rooms have reopened and therefore the amount is now quite balanced. So the amount of rooms have closed quite drastically, and obviously a lot of it in Europe. This has affected occupancy, as you will have known. So on a global picture, again, very blended numbers with huge variations within them, but very low numbers, of course. This graph is not always easy to understand, but I'll draw a little circle at the bottom that shows that's in the end of March, and each dot in each of these lines represents a market. And it just shows you a sound around that end of March where everything globally or internationally just started going down. And you see some of the less frequently discussed markets like Guam or a Chinese province, Shanxi, who have the highest occupancies in the world. So we'll touch on a couple of these in these next 10, 15 minutes. But it's important why these hotels close. Now, as an example, from an American example here, just looking at how GIP margins are affected by occupancy, you kind of need around that 30% level of occupancy to achieve those. So closing hotels becomes a very viable option when so many of these costs are fixed. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many closed hotels around the world. Now, I want to talk about recovery. Fortunately, we are here in Asia Pacific and not perhaps yet in Singapore where I'm based, but we are starting to see some rebounds and recoveries as well. So let's focus on a couple of those markets first. And you may have seen this graph and how the four different sets of how China has, mainland China has moved through the crisis. The big drastic fall, first in the world, 90% down. The slow recovery over 2 months. And it's really in that third part called normal patterns over there in April where we're starting to see some weekday recovery. We're starting to see some patterns that we're used to, just albeit, of course, at much lower than normal levels. And then at the end, that fourth piece is a holiday spike. That hook is very interesting and something we reported on in the last 7 to 10 days. So let's zone in on that a little bit because this is 30th April. Most people in mainland China have been in lockdown for now 3 months and they're ready for one of the biggest Labor Day holiday weekends. So they were obviously happy and the industry was happy to see that the holiday provided a great respite. It really grew the business up to almost 50%. It was driven by leisure, it's driven by specific markets around lakes, People drive to distance or easy with train. So huge spike and a great confidence boost for China and the industry and the wider world, arguably, when people ask us so much about it. And it also meant at the same time they were planning the National Congress in a couple of weeks in Beijing as well. Now, what happens after that is people go back to work. That makes sense last week, so it drops down. But it's encouraging to see that business then after that goes up to these high 30s and 40s in occupancy numbers after that across mainland China, where we saw it before. So it wasn't just a spike and then wane off. Interesting thing, of course, is where do we go next? Because it could start flattening out and it could continue growing. Remember that it's domestic growth. We are not seeing international borders or international flights yet. There's a lot of talk about it and everything. But for me right now, I'm seeing somewhere in between that. We'll have these spikes like the Congress in Beijing and other markets and holiday periods. So a lot of that stuff is going to continue to work in the next few weeks. So a mix between those two areas is probably where I see it. But there will be a ceiling where the domestic business does it. Switching over to South Korea, where it's a slightly different path, but also 2.5 months of lockdown and stricter measures. But what they were allowed to do were these, you look at the blue graph in occupancy there, there's been a lot of staycations over the weekend. So they'd allowed that occupancy went from 10, 15% up to 30%. But you will also notice how this gradually grows up for each weekend. And then you have their golden week, a long weekend, but spikes not just occupancy, but rate across. And that's not just in big cities. It's primarily in holiday resorts like Jeju or Daewon City and those places where we just see more and more of the leisure business happening. Flights as well. And obviously that will drop down. But the overall trend is that Korea is heading out of it gently. It's not going to be up to 60, 70, 80% straight away, but it's looking reasonably well for them at the time as well. So what's next? There's huge variations and uncertainties around the rest of the region, right? So if we look at what's next in line, and something I'll come back to a little bit throughout this is we are starting to see some small sprouts really of bookings. Thai resorts getting European bookings for December. That's quite opportunistic, if you will, if not optimistic. But generally, it is quite, we're not seeing the volumes that you would normally see yet, even very, very far out. We need more confidence from authorities, and I think general travelers need to have that apart from just general flights. The other risk, of course, that have come now is that there is second wave risk that could kill off those sprouts. Pardon my poor analogies. But if we move to a specific example on this and move down to Pacific regions, in New Zealand and Australia, what are these restrictions? When are they going away? And when do the general travelers get the confidence to embark on new trips? Starting with New Zealand, yes, there's still only essential travels today, and quarantines are filling the hotels, and there's no international flights. But they are managing cases very well. They are moving this week from level 3 up to level 2, which is, you know, very close to acting normally and within the society. And the interesting thing is that trans-Tasmanian bubble, right? So how can that help them? It's absolutely true that it would likely to help New Zealand more than it helps Australia. New Zealand depends on that a fair bit more. So we will absolutely see some interesting signs. If New Zealand can get travelers coming in for Australia, that's going to be a very welcome boost as well. So as you go over to Australia, same two first bullet points, but Qantas, who has had a lot of flights granted, are now gearing up for July, for school holidays, hopefully. And we are seeing fewer cases in Australia. States are starting to ease those restrictions by variation. You know, Victoria is more strict, South Australia is maybe not as strict, is opening up. And they have that huge domestic power to drive intrastate, but then also interstate travel for leisure, business, and drive, etc. And once the domestic flights come back up. So that's why we see the fundamentals in New Zealand and Australia coming up and potentially coming in recovery as well. But, you know, before you start dreaming that it's happening today, just a quick look on business on the books using our forward start. Sydney, yes, a couple of weeks out, maybe some business, but apart from that, on short term, it's really nothing. So the confidence is not there yet before you start hoping for it. And even if we switch to Melbourne and look 5-6 months out, that October looks like a little spike, it's only 8, 9, 10%. So it's still low volumes, but we think it is a little bit around the corner with some really strong potential. And if I switch over to Vietnam, and it makes sense because there are less than 300 cases in total, and it's also been managed and recovery great. And they've stayed down here around that occupancy level of 8, 9, 10%. And then we start seeing what happened in the last couple of weeks. You have a long weekend, a little bit of business coming in the last few days. What's behind that, and why are they beginning to grow some business? Well, first of all, their reboot is happening. They are now opening tourist locations, so the Halong Bay. Schools have opened, non-essential services, sure, with social distancing, but you got beaches opening in Da Nang, buses, more domestic flights. So even within those restrictions they have, their domestic machine has started to open up more than others. Even the China border up north has started custom clearance, and the ambition from the aviation as well. But Vietnam, again, showing strong signals on where they're heading. And I could say on the rest of ASEAN, right? So Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, not seeing much. Most of the hotels are closed. Now, they're easing restrictions a bit in Indonesia, so you could see some business coming back, but it's very early days and cases are rising as well. It's really in Philippines and Singapore where we have some kind of story where if I add the scale to this, 70 or 50%, you go, hang on, why are they so big? Well, in Singapore's case, it's quarantine and isolation business, full stop. That's been the case for quite some time. We expect that to lower down as the case volumes here in Singapore are going down, and we're still hoping that this circuit breaker of lockdown is going away around early June. Now, Philippines, it's a mix of that, but also somehow they lock down in various phases around the country. There's extended stay as well. It's not really the normal demand that you expect. So don't think that Singapore and Philippines are working normally with regular guests staying in hotels. But as we move around the region, Maldives, Sri Lanka, India, there's nothing really new to report. Most hotels, and many of them are closed. There's no real demand, no real international travel. I'm just showing you this to make sure that you're aware that Maldives and Sri Lanka obviously depend more on the international travel coming back as smaller markets. India has a huge domestic machine that can trigger that and maybe recover faster, but they are still not opening hotels. It's more closing hotels and extended the lockdown period as well. So nothing really to report at the moment on that. But if you look at Japan, there is a decline that we've seen in the last few months, of course, right? So January, February, March, but it was later than other markets. It was actually quite a lot later than many other markets. And as a result, it wasn't until April, and definitely now in May, with the state of emergency and more closed hotel groups, lower volumes of occupancy in the market. And of course, Japan, with the Olympics being postponed and many other events, and they were on this big tourism boom, are keen to see when can we start seeing the international arrivals again, working hard. And that's why I think it's a lot of the political relations that matter now, and how and whom with you can open up your business as early as possible. Now, if I recap on some of the sections and why markets recover, maybe you've seen this before, but I think it's important for context that not just on this crisis, but throughout most of them historically as well, domestic business has always been the first one, and we see that now. It's local, accessible travel where you can practice safe distancing, usually leisure and weekend business. In China, it started with economy and mid-scale for sure. But in other markets, like in South Korea, we're seeing in Australia as well, will be a little bit more high-end hotels that launches before you move into corporate, group, and international business. There are huge differences in how that's set up. And other markets, you know, I mentioned ASEAN. Hong Kong will take longer, for instance. That's going to take longer because of the political challenges that you've seen there as well, where occupancies there are more between 20 and 30% as well. Now, the recovery will, because of what we just said, if it was a snakes down on that slide, the ladders up and those steps is going to vary hugely depending on which market you are. It depends absolutely how the restrictions are being lifted and different phasing out. So you will have various markets that depend on domestic business more, that can come out of this quicker and run up those stairs than some of the others. Because the list of risk that I keep adding to is obviously big. People will have lower wealth when they come out. and the airlift may be very different from a short to medium term as well. And then we talk about health certificate needs for countries, for resorts, for cities as well. And that's, for me, the changed nature of the industry. I think long term, I think we'll probably get back to, this is too strong of an industry not to come back to a pretty good picture, but obviously it'll take time. And now, and you read the news, you obviously have the big failed rebound of the second wave impact that could happen. And be very interesting to see how China and South Korea manage that as they move out of that challenging time as well. So my conclusions, we know that China and South Korea are really pulling ahead. I think most of the world are asking us and most people how they are getting out of it, but predominantly China, which markets, how. Can't translate it directly, but it shows really strong indications on how it's been performing and how it's picking up. We know that the trend continues. They need to manage that, and it is still the domestic business, of course. Now, the revolution will not be televised was a famous song. This will, but the recovery cannot be rushed. We've seen earlier, we thought Korea might be sooner. We talk about second quarter being quite hopeful. Domestic will absolutely drive it. I think Vietnam has a potential to do that more wider than what we saw in Korea, because they're opening up the entire country more broadly and not doing that weekend spike you saw earlier on South Korea. And most people like what we're seeing in Australia and New Zealand, both from a civil services and medical standpoint, but obviously in the hospitality, and that trans-Tasman bubble potential can absolutely help them as well. But I think the variation is something that we are starting to see widely now, how a country like Malaysia or Maldives or Singapore or Japan will come out of this at different stages. And it relies on international travel, because if Vietnam is ready now for international travel, who else will it be that they can then bring in? Obviously, China is a big trading partner for that, so that could bring business for them and for Thailand as well, if Thailand opens up sooner rather than later. And that depends on the politicians and the restrictions that we have. But again, I think it's important that don't expect all airlines and all the airlift capacity to be available straight from day one. That will take some time as well for them who've been really hit hard. But we usually say whenever we present that everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's just not the end yet. So that kind of sums it up. And if you're more interested in China, every Thursday we release these 8-minute videos on it. But I will head down to our virtual booth with my colleague Kennedy. We can answer tons of questions there, depending on if we have time for any questions now.
Excellent. Jesper, thank you very much. And you've woken us up brilliantly, at least us in the UK. It's incredibly rich data, so thank you for that. Question for you, and absolutely you'll be down in the booth in the expo area, so thank you for staying around and providing your insight through the day. Question, however, at this moment, you've given us some incredibly powerful data and very cautious indications. What do you believe, however, is the most important factor that's going to assist with the rebound of APAC in terms of recovery from the current crisis, and especially knowing there's the risk of a second wave?
Yeah, I think it's the variations and movement, and when it came in and how it started, say in Malaysia, that impacted Singapore. So Singapore got all of a sudden a few 100,000 people that couldn't go home, and that created occupancy and RevPAR numbers here that they didn't expect. I expect the reverse, but in different ways. The movement restrictions and authorities, and that's why it's interesting to see, right? So how certain authorities are relying on experts and some make their own decisions. That's going to be the key driver, because we as an industry or everyone around it can set the stage, be ready with everything, but it's not until we switch that on in the airlift, I think it's going to be the key driver for all of this.
Indeed, we are living the great hypothesis right now. So, Jesper, thank you very much for warming up our stage. We're very grateful to have you with us for the day and appreciate your contribution as always. Excellent. Take